Hello, I'm Jenni Ramone from Nottingham Trent University's Postcolonial Studies Centre, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Formations event, which is part of the Milk segment, which engages with representations of breastfeeding. This evening's event is a conversation about gallery text, audience engagement, decolonisation in art galleries, and there's a particular focus on the representation of emotionally sensitive or challenging art and the ways that galleries are engaging new audiences through interventions such as rewriting gallery text, also known as gallery labels, and through other projects that we'll hear about this evening. To think about this, towards the end of the event, we'll look at 4 works of art which represent breastfeeding, which is the topic of my current research project. And we'll think about the important things to bear in mind when exhibiting artwork that could be controversial or sensitive, and which could elicit strong and potentially contradictory responses in audiences. I'm joined by 2 very special guests. Rebecca Randle, the Learning and Engagement Coordinator, and Helen Cobby, Assistant Curator, both from the Barber Institute of Fine Arts at the University of Birmingham. I'm so pleased that they're able to join me today because the Barber Institute has, over the last few years, led a number of really exciting projects focused on decolonising the gallery's holdings and on engaging new and diverse audiences and on gallery text itself. One of the projects we'll talk about today is called Hidden Histories, which aim to invite multiple audience reinterpretations while also revealing the hidden histories of works of art in the Barber collection. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that from Helen and Becca in a few minutes, but it might be useful to start by meeting Becca Randle and Helen Cobby and discussing the Barber Art Gallery and also what gallery text actually is. So thank you so much for being here, Becca and Helen. Are you happy to talk about the Barber Institute and about what gallery text is?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jenny. Thanks for having us here. We're really excited to be chatting to you this evening. I can tell you a bit about what the Barber is, because people might not have heard of it before. They might not know where it is. So it's an art gallery and concert hall at the University of Birmingham campus. And it's a sort of purpose-built, now Grade 1 listed building. And it was founded in 1932 by Lady Barber, who was a sort of founder of the trust that runs the Barber Institute. And the artwork in the collection is primarily European, Western canonical collection, and it's displayed in 4 main galleries. And in these galleries, you can enjoy paintings, works on paper like prints and drawings, but also sculpture, and coins, and other kind of decorative arts as well. But it's perhaps best known for its French 19th century paintings. And as you said, I'm Learning Engagement Coordinator there, so I work in the Learning Engagement team. And for us, the galleries are a home where exchange can take place between artists and audiences, spaces and materials, and also past and present as well. And as a team, we're all really passionate about developing and caring for a dialogue between people and the gallery. We do this through workshops, talks, resources, different collaborative projects. And as you said, we're going to be talking about a few of those that are relevant to your research today. I mean, it's important to note that we haven't been open, obviously, over the last year. So a lot of our engagement activity, as well as our exhibitions, have all gone online. So some of our projects have sort of changed form, but we'll have more about that later, I suppose. But I think I'll hand over to Helen now.
Yeah, so we have been closed for most of the time in the last year, but very pleased to say that we actually reopened in line with the government guidelines last week, and we've had lots of visitors coming through on our free time tickets. So you are able to go safely now back into the Barber, which is brilliant. During the lockdowns, which are obviously very difficult, we did also, though, have some more time and space to sort of critique what we've been doing and reevaluate how we do some of the things at the Barber as well as online, and to start making more changes. things perhaps that we've been thinking about before but haven't always had that reflective space to do. So one of the positives has been to really push our digital outputs that we've been doing and experimenting with what we can put online and how to engage audiences, both our loyal return audiences and also new people as well. And that's something we've wanted to do for a long time anyway. So we were thinking, how can we use it more effectively to mix our offering in terms of layered engagement, in terms of the ideas and texts across multiple platforms. So thinking about how it can work both physically and virtually. So that's something that we'll might touch on as well as we go through our presentation today. So we thought we'd kind of pare it back a bit and just start with what is gallery text. And I'm sure it's going to mean a lot more things than we'll cover today. And I'll just give a sort of snippet of some of the gallery text that we have at the Barber and what it means for us here, really. So it can mean a lot of different things, from quite formal pieces of interpretation, from the gallery labels. And on this slide here, you can see some of them in situ above the art sculpture that we have at the gallery, in our blue gallery. And then you can see in the background a Whistler painting and a little label by it as well. So if you go round the gallery, you can expect to see a little label for each of the works individually. And they kind of stand alone, really. So there's a little bit of clutter there, I suppose, with what the labels look like, as we have one for every work next to it. But we also try and pare things back, so we don't have introductory panels, which can also count as gallery text. We let each room, and there's 4 rooms, sort of speak for themselves, really. And gallery text can also mean pointers of where to find more information rather than being that information, the content itself. So the last image you can see on the slide is about where you can get magnifiers from, which can be really helpful if you want to examine something very closely and have that kind of intimate engagement with it. And we do really encourage close looking at the Barber. So that's always been something we've tried to highlight, as well as perhaps information sheets and handouts that visitors can ask for if they want to know more information. So we don't necessarily have all of our gallery texts immediately on display because it could look a bit cluttered, and we really try and pare that back so that you have the artwork speaking first, but sort of signposts of where to find more information if you'd like. So it's optional. Gallery text should never be forced really within your face. So what we'll do is we'll just talk a little bit about what gallery labels are, which is the sort of main gallery text that we have at the Barber, which we saw on the previous screen. So it can mean many things for the Barber and for many other places as well. I think it's one of the first forms of engagement and information that visitors come across. They're readily available. As I said, they're always pinned to the wall next to the work, so you've always got that pointer towards them. At the Barber, they're physical objects in themselves, so we make them in-house and we mount them in-house. We have a collections technician who does the practical side of it, and I'll design them up. So it's a way of working and producing these physical objects. I think they're very traditional as well. It's what a lot of our visitors do expect to see when they come into the gallery. They're those very short labels of about 180 words, or sort of 120 words, it does depend a bit, with a sort of tombstone layer of information at the top where you have the artist dates, the title of the work, where it was made, the date of creation if known, the media, what it's made from. So it's sort of a pointer, an introduction to the work, if you like. And that's what we call the tombstone information, which should be really short. As I mentioned, they should stand alone, so we don't need extra introductory panels. They should be sort of self-explanatory, introducing the work in some way. And because there's not very much text to them, they do have to be very selective as well. So we have to think, what kind of perspective or stance are we going to take? And we have to be aware that we're doing that, but also be confident in what we decide to do, because you can't include everything. That could be another sort of form of gallery clutter. otherwise, which we're trying to get away from. And because they're selective, and they're often the first thing that you see when you come towards the work, they are sort of power holders, if you like. They can really direct a certain reading or interpretation or meaning of a work. They're helping to create a meaning. So we have to be aware of their power, but also constantly critique it so that we are sort of in control of that, and visitors also feel in control. They don't feel overwhelmed or intimidated by these sort of power holders. So they should be pointers in, they should be invitations to look more closely at a work, they should give suggestions rather than be a formula or containing sort of hard perspectives or ways into a work, particularly if that can't be backed up or it's a certain viewpoint. They should really encourage close looking and meaningful experiences, I think, and that can often mean sort of starting with a detail of the work to get you really hooked into it and looking closely, and then kind of expand back into more of the context of it. A good thing about the labels that we produce at the Barber is that they can be replaced very quickly because we make them in-house, so they can continually evolve and be subject to critique and change, and I think that's a great aspect to them, despite them also being so traditional in a way. And yeah, traditional, are they then outdated? So you can't have too many different things going on within the label, and we're constantly having conversations of how we can open them up, whether that's with QR codes or how to deal with labels in galleries at the moment. And although it's quite a while ago now, in 2013, Tate Britain had a reshuffle of its permanent displays and its gallery labels, and it stripped the gallery of most of its labels. So that at the time was quite shocking, or so the Guardian thought, because people expect to come and see these labels, and that's often been something that people have thought about the Tate Gallery before. What do they say? How have they grouped works together? So they decided to get rid of them altogether. And that really raised the question about who are these labels for, because apparently the Guardian said that the people who are most shocked were other curators and institutions rather than members of the public. So perhaps it's something that in-house we feel we have to rely on more, or we feel that they're more important than they are. So that could be something really interesting to discuss. How can they work at this moment in time? I think the example of the Tate changing how it uses labels or not using them shows that rethinking labels isn't new, but perhaps the motivations for it, well, they're obviously very complex and they're constantly shifting. So perhaps that's the bit that's changed. I have sort of touched upon this next bit about how we write them, and I've pulled out in purple some guidelines from the Getty's Text and Label Design Guide. And I think it's really good because it really focuses that you are writing for visitors, and it's almost like there should be a mini conversation within the gallery. So if someone says, what is it, what's here, why is it there, why should I care? These labels should attempt to answer that to some extent, or help give hooks so that people can explore that or answer it for themselves. So I love the way that the Getty's pulled out all those different questions. So the labels are in part a response to it, and in part kind of an expansion upon these questions. And as I said, they should be very straight to the point, very clear and structured, and just really own a specific angle as well. I didn't mention that they also should be really open, so we should always admit when we don't know something, and address, but also invite questions. And also focus on what's at hand, the object, the artwork itself. We shouldn't just be doing contextual information and not an artist biography either. That can be found or should be found elsewhere, I think. It's very much an engagement with what is in front of you, while also bringing in the human element of that, how it might be experienced, how it was perhaps originally used or displayed, so that people can imagine it in a space or with its other lives going through history. I think that's always a really nice way of engaging people. And then finally, I think it's always important to have multiple authors or editors for these texts. So we do have that to some extent at the Barber, in that it will go around different departments, different members of staff, and everyone will have a good look at it and kind of rework things. I think in future, something we'd really like to try is more perhaps imaginary or creative labels that perhaps have responses or questions or snippets of poetry from artists or members of the public, and other specialists as well. So yes, watch that space.
Thank you. It's fascinating, and it's fascinating for me to know that there's such a lot behind the idea of the gallery label or gallery text, because I don't think I realised before speaking to you just how many kind of layers and versions and possibilities there were, and how much you think about it yourselves. I also mentioned in the introduction that you've taken part in various decolonisation projects, and I'd love to hear more about what you do at the Barber Institute and about the ways that the Barber, but also perhaps if you can talk more about the art gallery and museums world in general, how it's working in a changing landscape, responding to things like Black Lives Matter, Black History Month, the push towards Black History Month 365, and decolonisation in general. And I wondered if you have any ideas about things like practices that you've seen working well in the art world more generally to encourage public engagement with art, but also the things that you've been doing and that you've seen as working well at the Barber.
Yeah, so mine and Helen's work together has very much been focused on research and interpretation around the collection. And, you know, under the sort of term of decolonisation, we produced a sort of Venn diagram resource for one of our recent online exhibitions, Sites of Wonder, that kind of displays photography from Albert Edward, Prince of Wales' tour of the Middle East. And this was in partnership with the Royal Collection. So one of the resources that we produced in the learning team for this was a short pack for visitors about colonial worldviews and how these might present themselves through art, collections, art objects. And I think this is quite a useful Venn diagram because it shows you the complexity of all of these worldviews and where they might come from and how they might manifest themselves, which is perhaps a good way to start talking about what we've been doing. Because if you imagine this diagram and all of these aspects, the task really is to go through the collection, and whenever you see one of these things, ask yourself these critical questions. Are we being transparent about this? Are we do we have enough information about it? Is there missing information? How might people feel about this? How can we be sensitive around this? And so yeah, our work has been very much around the collection. Some of these ideas from colonial worldviews, and Helen and I have been working on that rather than perhaps some of the more systematic institutional issues around, you know, decolonising the workforce, for example, or policies and that kind of thing. And I think across the sector, there's obviously more work to be done, as with many sectors around that. But to do this, we've worked with artists, writers, young people, consultants, students, academics, working with schools at the moment as well, in different projects to try to get lots of different points of view, and also come up with creative ways of kind of responding to some of the artworks that might have some of these themes within them or some of these histories around them. I mean, we're aware, though, that the idea of decolonisation, although you know, as a term, it might feel problematic to some people. It also might feel like something that people might think of as being quite new. But actually, you know, the idea of putting what's sometimes called a subaltern histories to the forefront is something that has been happening since around the 1960s, 1970s. So we're aware that there is a long legacy of this type of work in interpreting histories, and we're also aware of the more recent work and the changing meaning of that word or this work as we sort of move along. The Museums Association, if we're thinking about the sector wider and outside of the Barber, the Museums Association has a campaign and a statement and resources around decolonising museums that is very publicly on their website and advocates very much for the sector working towards decolonisation. And locally in 2016, Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery developed a co-curated exhibition called The Past Is Now, which explored Birmingham's colonial history and different public attitudes towards that history. When I went to visit, something that I thought was quite striking from that was a display, actually an engagement area that had a fact about how many people in Britain actually believed that the British Empire was a positive force, and the percentage was much higher than I would have really liked to have imagined. And there was a lot of conversation through text, through visitor written text on that piece there. So really kind of not shying away from those questions and presenting people with these sort of differing, sensitive, highly loaded kind of views. And it was a really kind of landmark exhibition. I think that the sector definitely found it quite brave and quite innovative, but it wasn't without its problems as well. And some of the co-curators on the project, after taking part, released essays, blogs about their experiences. And Sumya Kasim has a fantastic essay called "The Museum Will Not Be Decolonised," and that is you can also see that as a visual essay as well on Vimeo as well. Could be a link to that somewhere. Yes, and you know, the idea that okay, we're doing this work, but it actually will never be done. And I think that is something for us as, you know, professionals in the sector to kind of come to terms with. You know, although we will try to do this work and do our best to find new ways of doing it, constantly being reflective and critical and creative and open, we won't achieve it. And we kind of have to be okay with that. I think Helen's got a few examples that she might like to share as well around the sector.
Yeah, thanks, Becca. I think that's really interesting that there'll always be some sort of sense that it's ongoing work, constantly ongoing and needing to sort of change and constantly critique itself as well. And also to see how sort of different places, how their sort of attempts so far have been received. And there's always seems to be such a backlash towards it, as well as some positivity that can be taken forward. So I was thinking about how the National Trust's report on slavery and colonisation that was released last September 2020, although had been worked on obviously for several years before that was received. Because personally, I thought it was a brilliant thing that the Trust was doing, and very timely, I suppose, but also overdue. But it was interesting how much they then had to, I think, follow it up with different blog posts or online as well, with videos to explain why they were doing it and really defend their position. And they talked a lot about how it's their responsibility to make sure they are historically accurate and academically robust when communicating their places and their collections that they care for, and how very much the report was part of that. It wasn't going away from what they do. So it was interesting that perhaps they did get quite a lot of criticism from some members, general public, funders or politicians. I suppose it was wrapped up very much at the time, partly around conversations around controversial monuments, and also the sort of charity law as well, and what they should be doing. So it does show that asking sometimes uncomfortable questions, or what some people might find very uncomfortable or surprising when they're very used to a certain context or way of sort of experiencing culture, it's obviously still not easy to address, and needing obviously to be extremely sensitive in the ways that it is addressed. Yeah, I think the idea of responsibility is something that I keep coming back to, and it does appear in lots of discussions at the moment, and wrapped up very much in how we can, as institutions, stay relevant as well to current moments and hold ourselves accountable for the information that we hold and share and preserve, as well as sort of moving forwards for recovery post-COVID, hopefully. So yes, there's a lot to do at the Barber and in the sector more widely, I think. And there's a presentation that Becca and I attended quite recently, where we heard about some of the people who've been working at an initiative at Derby Museum, how brilliant that has been, really. They started it before COVID, but it's obviously changed and developed as it's gone along. It was to do with redisplaying and redocumenting their World Collections Gallery at Derby. And they've worked with the storyteller and artist documenter Alison Solomon, who they've worked with before in the past as well. So she knew the collections and the ways of working very well, but also could be that critical voice from the inside as well as the out, really. So we were struck with how interesting and open and creative their project seemed. It included lots of different sections like humanity and moving quotes from poets and other writers, as well as a really emotional engagement with the collections and the display itself. And they did really stress how the terminology is so key for displaying works, as well as how that is presented as well. So they encourage kind of visitor feedback in terms of what the text that they put forward. For example, they had a wall of different objects that were collected in different ways over history, and they had just very simple headings above each group saying traded, gifted, found, and moving to looted and stolen, and sort of asking for engagement about what those words sort of meant to people, how they felt about them, and then how does that change how you view the object and what its function should be within a museum. So it seemed like that was doing something really interesting in quite a sort of simple and visually appealing and striking way. So it just shows that the language and the way things are displayed and the relationship between the gallery text and the method of display are all so bound up together and all really matter.
So I can share a little bit about the Hidden Histories project. So the project started in 2018, and it was organised as part of Black History Month that year. I think I'd been in post maybe a year by this point, and there was a feeling at the Barber that it was expected that there would be projects and programming around Black History Month, but that the organisation felt like it had never got it right. And we've certainly now moved away from the idea of programming for that month. But at this point, we wanted to try to do something to try and acknowledge some of the issues that we felt were in the collection, although there hadn't been any very in-depth research into what they were in the past. So we worked with Dr. Asher Rogers in Post-Colonial Literature Department at the University of Birmingham, and their students, and an artist and writer called Jifa Benson. And the project ran over a series of workshops and then an event at the end. And the first workshop, Jifa ran a tour through the collection. We'd had some discussions prior about what there was in the collection. I had rough ideas about what Jifa might be interested in. And they were artworks that either represented or had been collected from people of colour or had links to historic exploitation. And there was a very open discussion about these artworks, and Jifa, the way that she delivered the session was so sensitive, and there was a lot of space for discussion, and it felt a very safe space, I think, for everybody involved because of her skill as a facilitator. I can't stress enough how much difference that makes when you're talking about sensitive histories. We mentioned Corinne Fowler's project and the National Trust just now, and I heard her speak recently about the terminology that we use to talk about these types of projects, and the term kind of contested history, how this is used a lot, and how she's moved away from contested to sensitive, because contested automatically sets up this combative environment that isn't necessarily productive always. And sensitive sets people up to be sensitive and to provide care, and it's just a completely different headspace to contested. So I think that's very much reminded me of Jifa's approach on the Hidden Histories project. And I think that from looking at the students and how they engage with the whole project, they felt really supported by that. So that was the first session, looking and talking artwork about the artworks, discussion. And then the second session was a kind of mass research session where the Barber sort of handed over the curatorial files for the works that we've been looking at. And these are really analog files that have information going back, gosh knows how long, different notes from different curators, different people that have worked in the Barber over the past decade in some cases, any research that's been done, and any correspondence about those artworks as well, sort of printed off emails, letters from pre-email. So that's the sort of information that isn't generally that accessible to a visitor. I suppose it's the opposite of the label in a way, because it's so dense. Some of them are really dense, and then some of them are really thin, which is another interesting thing that we found. Why has nobody chosen to look at this artwork and research it further? And why has this one got a great big wad of information in it? So students, staff, and Jifa looking through all of these files, and I know it doesn't sound like a huge thing, but these files that were usually stored away, it felt like a big sort of transparent move. It felt like the sharing of power and information, and I think the analog element of it just makes that all the more kind of exciting as well. So we went through those, and then Jifa ran a session about creative writing. She's primarily a writer and performer, and how you might explore emotion in creative writing around the artworks that we've been looking at. And then these students went away in their own time and wrote their alternative labels through creative writing for the artworks that we had discussed. And then the celebratory event, the students were so brave, they performed their labels, and they were also on display as that evening unfolded as well. The labels were only up for that one night, but they did go online, and they lived online after that event, and they were kind of interestingly kind of just put beneath the actual label for the artwork that is online. So for the Barber, I feel like this was a really big project, because although it was fairly light touch, it was only a few workshops, it didn't take months, it gave us a really personal, emotionally engaged readings of artworks that dealt with sensitive histories that we weren't necessarily aware at this stage these artworks might elicit these kind of responses. We had maybe an idea, but not the extent, perhaps, and also maybe some of the areas that we might need to research more to make sure that we are presenting information that is needed in order to be transparent as well. So this kind of kicked off my work around this area at the Barber Institute. And then over the years, I've done several other projects in terms of audience engagement around this. And one of them is a project called Reclaiming the Teapot. I chose to share this one because it's not necessarily based around text, but it's perhaps another way of questioning an artwork or playing around with its meaning. So it was a collaborative project between Barber Collective, which was the Barber's youth programme at the time, and a Birmingham-based artist called Navi Kaur, running from October to December in 2019. So the project took Teapot with Stand, which was made in 1785. It's an object in the Barber's decorative arts and sculpture collection as a starting point for discussion and creative responses, particularly exploring its specific histories of the legacies of colonialism. The teapot, I didn't find this out about this, the way I don't think I've ever told Helen this either. I found out about this teapot's history by actually speaking to Corrine Fowler. As part of my MA research, I went to visit her at Leicester and spoke to her about her projects. I was particularly interested in how she spoke to children and worked with children around these sensitive histories and, you know, what she's learned from that. And we were discussing some of the sites that she'd explored, and she mentioned the Beckford estate and how the Beckford family's wealth originated from the international slave trade. And I said, oh my God, Beckford? Oh, we have a Beckford object in our collection, and it's a solid gold teapot. And we both looked at each other and we said, gosh, you know, that is a really explicit object, because it really demonstrates the grotesque wealth that was generated from the international slave trade. And not only that, the display of that through this artwork that couldn't be used as a teapot because it would melt. So it literally has no purpose other than to display wealth through this exploitation. So working with Navi, we looked at this object, we had some conversations around it. Navi's art practice is very much based in her own heritage and her family's origination from South Asia, and she kind of documents her grandparents a lot through her artwork, and also a lot about food. She's interested in like the history of food and you know how that can make people feel. So she was really interested in talking about tea, and we did this with the young people. So again, it was a very similar format in that there was a very open discussion around the teapot, what they felt about it before they knew the history and what they felt about it maybe afterwards and after they'd explored it as well. And then a lot of working in the art classroom with snacks and clay and building their own teapots. And something that was quite beautiful that wasn't really planned in the project as well was that the young people were really interested in sharing their own memories or experiences of tea in their own families. And the young people brought in teapots from their houses. We had teapots from Morocco and other parts of the world, and it actually became a really beautiful sharing of what tea might mean in a sort of positive way, even though we know about the history of the East India Company and, you know, this object that we're looking at, the sort of environment that we had and the creative making with our hands and the chatting. became quite productive in a really positive way. And by the end of it, the young people had made these reclaimed teapots. So they had subverted the meaning in the Beckford gold teapot and used it as a sort of tool for reclaiming through their own. And some of the young people decided to make very colonial teapots and really go down that route of having Union Jacks on them and having them shaped like boats and ships and things like that, and having them quite scary in that way. And some of the young people just wanted to focus on, their own experiences of tea and the positive aspects of that, with mint leaves and those kinds of things. And they were really beautiful. So yeah, that was a project that we worked on. But I think that leads on nicely to talking about how that information that the Barber then had about how people felt about the teapot, this new history that we maybe hadn't talked about before, about the teapot, and what we were going to do about that in terms of formal interpretation.
Yes, I think it's such a good example of how we worked positively across departments and using activities within the gallery space to then inform what would be within those spaces once the activities and the people weren't there anymore, so that it could have some sort of lasting impact and change on how we presented things. So we did look again at the Beckford objects, and there are 2 in the Barber's collection. So we thought, well, we've always displayed them together, partly just because they're from the collection, and it's sort of quite good perhaps to have a dialogue between the 2, and see them as perhaps they would have been seen. But I thought what was quite striking was looking at how other galleries and places have also dealt with their Beckford items, because there's so many across the country in large and small institutions, including the V&A, and they have put online quite a long sort of lengthy blog about how they went about approaching theirs. And I thought it was also applicable to the Barber in terms of some of the feedback that they'd published. And I've put the quote here on the slide by the actor Rudolph Walker, who sort of had a response to the old labels that were up at the V&A saying, amazing, everyone would hail Beckford, look what he's British art and design, because he was such an extraordinary collector, really. He amassed so many objects. And then he goes on to say, not really understanding on whose back he acquired such wealth and fortune. And he thinks because of that, the text panels are quite misleading, and it should first and foremost sort of openly acknowledge how he amassed that wealth and the people that were involved in the exploitation, as Becca was saying. So we looked again at our interpretation as well, and first thought about the platform, how we were sharing it. And we had these laminated information handouts originally that would be sort of in a holder near the works of art. And we thought, actually, perhaps we do need the ordinary labels, which I've discussed before, because they can be physically closer to the works. And also it sort of continues the rhythm of the gallery. So perhaps more people are encouraged to read them. They don't think, oh goodness, it's now in another format, and there's more works on that list to sort of look through and find. So in some ways not as accessible, or it kind of highlights it in a different way, where actually we want that same engagement with these works as with any other, in terms of people spending the time of looking at them and thinking about them. So we turn to the ordinary labels again, but with the revised content, we looked at the collector and the issues that his family raised, particularly their involvement in the slave trade, as well as Beckford's potential affair with an underage boy. So there's several different sensitive histories that needed to be drawn out and kind of woven together between the objects. So this was an example really where the new normal labels kind of have a conversation with each other. So I know I said they should stand alone, but here we kind of thought we need to break that model. And so it's appropriate to do so for something like this, where there's so much to unpack, and wanting to introduce these ideas in a way that is sensitive, that has the person at the forefront of it, rather than just diving straight into the maker or the medium of the pieces, which of course are very caught up with the history as well. So it can always be that balance, perhaps, of looking at the subject matter and then not taking away from the artist's skill either, who made the pieces. So it was a really interesting kind of case study, and helpful, I think, for how the Barber thinks it's going to move forwards. There's some other ongoing approaches and changes that we've been doing too, from what seems like very small in terms of sort of labelling how we introduce artists who we don't know who they are. So we used to put unknown Italian artist, for example, but we've now changed that to unrecorded. So we're very much taking back the responsibility of that and thinking, we don't know it because perhaps in the past it hasn't been documented by the collectors, by institutions. So it's very much trying to acknowledge that, and it leaves it open then that perhaps it can be refound and re-recorded. It's not a sort of closed, unknown, final way of introducing this artist. So I feel like that's such a positive step forwards, even very small. We have also introduced some extra information sheets. I think I mentioned earlier that people can ask for, so there's pointers in the galleries for them, as well as involving our visitor services team more, who are the sort of first line of engagement within the galleries in terms of Barber staff, so that we can have discussions with them across departments again about the sort of questions that we think might be raised by these works, thinking about how we will discuss sensitive and emotional ideas with a range of visitors who may come and ask questions at the gallery. We also are looking into QR codes, and this summer we'll have some for the first time within the gallery that will give more information for certain works within exhibitions and displays, and also lead to further research that we've been doing on some of the permanent collection, including a 17th century Spanish painting that Becca and I will talk a bit about in a minute, which has been a big research project of ours over the last year. So it's features on the new section of our website, which is called the Unlearning Colonial Legacies section. And we then trying to kind of group all our different ideas and projects so far in one place, so that these things start to become much more integrated within the gallery as a whole, and not sort of lost in our own internal archives. I think, should we go on to look at the Rio project that we've been doing, and then discuss a bit how it's helped us work across departments and introduce new meetings around the collection?
Yeah. So after doing these kind of projects with young people and different artists and writers, our own awareness of the connotations of the artworks in the collection grew, and we kind of realised that there was a large amount of information missing from the research that the organisation has around these topics, and that this kind of needed to be addressed. I did have one experience wanting to address one of the artworks in the collection that I felt was quite sensitive and problematic, and reaching out to an artist to say, would you like to help us interpret this and unpick it through your practice? And the response was, quite rightly, actually no, because on your side, you haven't done enough research as an organisation yourselves for me to want to work with you on this. So it was feeling to me to be quite urgent that we really needed to do our own work on this, as kind of members of staff within the organisation. I think collaboration is so important, especially for an institution, to ensure that you are inviting critique from the outside. And this particular critique was so important. And it really meant that we kind of needed to go away and do some hard work. When the Barber closed in March last year, all of my engagement projects were cancelled. Everything stopped, as with everywhere. I got in touch with Helen. I said, we're going to have a few months now where there's going to be less to do, probably. We're so lucky not to be furloughed. Do you fancy working together to try to pull some of the information that we've generated from some of these engagement projects together with some kind of hefty research into the collection? And that's what we did. Our ongoing research around the Rio painting, which is called The Marriage Feast at Cana, painted in the 17th century, aimed to sort of explore, critique, and lead us away from inherited knowledge or gaps in knowledge that are centred around dominant white patriarchal experiences or worldviews. And we've developed this research into a few different formats, which I think Helen's going to mention. But the work really illustrates how charged Blackness was in Spanish society in the early modern period, and the interconnected relationship between race and religion as well, which we didn't expect to find in such detail. One of the things we found as well when we were doing this research, that this gap in this research is much wider than our organisation. It seemed like there was not loads of research around this topic in the wider field as well, which only made us want to do it more. So we set out to question received knowledge by making a case that there was more to the boy's inclusion. There's a young black boy at the forefront of the painting. You can probably see if it's on the screen now. There was more to his inclusion within the composition than simply his signification of the patron's wealth and status, and which is often the reason given for an inclusion of a person of colour in a painting of this type. So we kind of unpicked that in varying length, depending on which format we were looking at. But we also kind of found that this kind of painting was really concerned with creating an image of the other, but also simultaneously creating a picture of, in this case, what white Spanish Christians would perceive as themselves, or the in-group, and it was kind of concerned with whiteness as well. So yeah, we worked on this and we've kind of just finished it. Not that it will ever be finished, but...
Yeah, it's nice that the research has been shared or will be shared soon in different ways, because it makes us see different parts of it as well, and then to do more research into some areas that need to be a bit more robust perhaps. So it is constantly ongoing, and it's just been really refreshing to see a work in the collection in this way, with a sort of, as Becca likes to say, a kind of deep dive into one painting, and just exciting the connections that we're slowly starting to make with it, with specialists in the field, other galleries that might have a work by the artist as well, and how they sort of work together and possible collaborations in the future, because it is an unusual painting to depict a boy like this at this time in 17th century Seville. So it's really something that needs to be examined more across different fields, I think. So some of the ways that we've been sort of getting these ideas and research out so far has been updating the gallery label and the accompanying website text, the sort of first line of engagement, if you like, as well as kind of introducing the research project on our new learning section of the website. We pitched it to the Art UK and the Guardian's collaboration that they did earlier in the year, called Great British Art Tours. So we had a very short introduction to our ideas included in that, which was exciting. They're really difficult to edit the ideas down, but it did make it all stronger and the case much more kind of watertight for doing so. And we thought it was quite a nice way of being linked to what other galleries are doing as well, and perhaps being seen by different audiences, which is something we're always so keen on. We did think, because of the content and the difficult kind of links that we were finding out between race and religion at the time, that we did want to open it up to other people's reactions to what we were suggesting, and also to the image itself. So we found one really good way of doing that so far was putting a kind of open call on the Art UK's detective web section, and we did have lots of different conversations and ideas coming back from that, which is still ongoing. It's such a good resource in general, the detective site, and something we would like to use more now. We've kind of opened it up with that first work to talk about. And then, talking of talks, Becca and I did fairly recently an audio talk together that introduced some of our work, which is part of a series that we've been doing all the way through the lockdowns at the Barber. And it's a nice way of getting different staff involved and picking their own works and showcasing their own research. So it was good to be part of that as well. And then later this summer, we've got a longer article coming out with the University of Birmingham's Midlands Art Papers, which again, we're really pleased to be a part of, and somewhere where we can put a bit more of our ideas in, which will be great. But it's also, when we've had internal presentations within the Barber, when we've been presenting our ideas and the research on the work, it's led to quite a big development, really, in terms of the meetings that we have around engagement and interpretation across the collection. So we now have something called reinterpretation meetings every month with a range of staff, and the agenda is really varied and never ending in terms of what we're all keen and interested in and need to address. So it shouldn't be led by personal interest, but it's a great way, even over Zoom, of having sometimes these more informal conversations about the collection, about what we should be doing with it, questions that we have about it as well. So that's been such a positive development for us at the Barber, and that stemmed really from this project on Mario's painting.
Thank you. It's so fascinating to hear about everything that you're doing. And I know that some of the collections that you've worked with have had quite emotive content, probably more in line with some of the paintings that we're going to talk about in a moment, but some of them perhaps even more kind of distressing content. And I wondered whether you could talk generally about how you have to think about some of your works and some of your exhibitions in terms of the potential emotional responses from audience. And I wonder how you manage works or collections that can generate strong emotions, and what you see as your kind of role or priority, or whether you ever refuse to exhibit work because of the potential impacts it might have.
I think from a sort of engagement point of view, working with people in the place, I think it's about making sure that it's a safe environment, and if it's a workshop or a talk or something of that kind, making sure that there is a safe space to go to should you need to exit, and making sure everyone's aware of the content that they might be about to engage with in the space. I think, yeah, having a member of staff that's maybe waiting in that safe space as well, should anyone, you know, want to talk things through or just need a breather. And they're things that we've done in the past in terms of engagement. But I think Helen's got more to say about maybe display.
Yeah, some of the ideas I was thinking of or that we've done so far, we have at times put sort of content warning with the research or with the work as well, and particularly in some of our displays of prints and drawings, so that people are always given the choice and are not sort of suddenly confronted with something. So it's very much making sure that visitors feel in control of what they're seeing and when, and also the context in which people see things. So we've also translated that online as well for one of our Tuesday talks, so that it doesn't come as a surprise in any route in that you might want to take to these works. And when we're considering pieces for display, yeah, we do consider, does there need to be a warning that it's coming in some way, and do we need to have already kind of built up the context to help account for its presence, and then being very responsible about why it's being displayed, that we are showing it, and that people across departments, including visitor services team, have a good understanding of that and can take responsibility for it. I think if we do decide to display something of that nature, the gallery text is quite key as well about whose voice should it be, or I think particularly trying to get sort of multiple voices involved is something that we're very much at the start of really and need to explore further, because sometimes hard tombstone information on a gallery label doesn't always seem like the right way forward in those instances. So I'm very much interested in exploring ways that you can be led to work more with the senses, and leaving space for visitor feelings and emotional responses as well, perhaps encouraged by there being an emotional response on the label too, as an invitation or kind of validation or kind of slowing down of information that people can consume. I think audio engagement can also be really good with that, and mention QR codes that we're trying to explore there, so that things can be taken in different ways as well. And yeah, I was thinking of a couple of works in particular where there's been that kind of inter-department collaboration with how we've shown something or interpreted things. I haven't put the work itself on the slide, but it's Katie Colvitt's Women with Dead Child, an etching that she made in 1903. It's almost a sculpture really, with how the kind of figure of the mother bending over a dead child has been kind of ripped from the surface of the paper. So the way that it's been made, the mark making, is so strong and so emotional and violent and really echoes the content. So it's striking and upsetting and traumatic in every way that you might approach it, including the size as well. It's about sort of 40 by 50 centimetres. So Colvitt's works are really popular at the Barber, and it's lovely to have a female artist from the time represented in the collection. But it's how we use this work in particular that we've done in a couple of different ways, including my colleagues, others in the Learning and Engagement department. There's been lots of workshops around death, dying and bereavement, and that work has formed a central part of those workshops that have been led by the head of public engagement and also a registered nurse and lecturer at Birmingham University School of Nursing. So you do get such a diverse of voices and experiences and people who have been involved perhaps in palliative care from a frontline approach. And all these workshops have been in small groups with private reflection time, but also space to just voice some of the feelings around these themes and these experiences, which isn't always there to do.
Yeah, just on that, when Jen started doing those projects, they are so light touch. We felt that, you know, maybe it won't work. We're so used to sort of over structuring an engagement activity. We'll do this, then we'll do this, then we'll do this, and then we'll get them to think about this. Whereas with Jen's project around death and dying, it's just the works and then a sheet of a few questions around how to maybe look, suggestions of how you might engage with the artwork, and then it is all discussion, and there's so much time and space, and the amount of different readings that you get for the same artwork is incredible. And I think a big part of that is a lot of the works are in the prints and drawing study room where there are no labels, and although they have a pack and they could look, I mean, a lot of the time they don't. And something that really comes through is that when that information is taken away, these artworks can really be a conduit for actually talking about our own experiences. I've seen members of the public say, oh, you know, this reminds me, maybe it's an experience like this one. And actually this is a way of them sharing something they've been through without actually sitting down and telling a stranger about something that's happened to them. So it's really light touch, really beautiful, really open, just giving people a lot of space. It's a fantastic project. Sorry, interrupted.
Interesting. And it sort of just shows how many different ways there are to interpret a work of art, and that they're all valid, and that it can be a springboard just to think about stories or your own experiences. And it's such a good way perhaps to help people articulate what they're feeling or what they've experienced without feeling that it's a really personal kind of opening up. It's the way of looking through the work, so it goes on a kind of physical journey of thinking and looking. I think that's something that's so exciting about art, that it can be used in so many different ways and help people kind of navigate emotional qualities and ideas. I think that the project, the death and dying workshops, have helped perhaps move the Barber towards a bigger project that we're just at the start of, called Barber Health. And we've got the logo up there that uses the NHS colours, saying our collection, your well-being. And it's hopefully going to be a project that lasts more than the year that we've got the original funding from the Art Fund, which aims to place health and well-being at the heart of the Barber's engagement work and beyond, into interpretation, into everything that we do, hopefully. So we're just at the start of that, and I won't speak to that very much at the moment, but something to think about perhaps later on. But it's interesting, I went to the Arnold Feeney in Bristol recently to see their current exhibition called A Picture of Health, which looks at about 11 women photographers from a collection. And I was really struck with how it seems such a good example of lots of different places are turning towards caring for visitors. And hopefully that's something that Barber Health is going to help the Barber do as well. And on the Arnold Feeney handout, it opens with questions. It says, how are you? How do you feel? How do you look? So it's very much turning it back to the visitor. And I thought, oh, we've kind of come to see things, not to think, how do we feel? I want to be taken away from myself. But it was such a good way of just having that physical engagement with art and with yourself all in the same space in a really kind of sensitive and emotional way. Because curating really at its heart is about caring for collections and for visitors equally. Those are the two really important things. And I always think that, curating it's kind of a cliche really that people say, but it's from the Latin cura, meaning to care. And sometimes you think, oh, it sometimes seems so far from that, but it's good that so many places are sort of stopping and trying to get back to that core of what it's about caring.
Okay, so having thought about the ways in which you might manage emotional responses to art, in the last section, maybe we'll think about some of those images of breastfeeding. As I mentioned, I'm currently working on a research project on the representation of breastfeeding in art and in literature. And the more I get involved in this project, the more I'm aware of how sensitive a topic this is, even in academia, where we're used to dealing with challenging material and contexts. In my previous event formations, I was in conversation with an artist and two academics based in the US and Canada, Dion Irving Bremyer, who's also a novelist, and Anne-Marie Short, who mentioned that their research is often met with silence and a kind of shutting down, not knowing what to do with this research, even by the research coordinators at their institutions. And it feels as though people are either really uncertain about how to engage with breastfeeding, they just don't know what to do with it, or they have very rigid and particular views about it. So either way, this must be a really difficult subject to tackle for a broad public audience. And I'm sure this is something that's true of many of the challenging topics or sensitive topics that you've dealt with in the work that you've exhibited. So I thought we might just have a quick conversation about how you might engage audiences or what you might write in gallery text if you were going to exhibit some of the works of art depicting breastfeeding that I've selected for us to look at today. And really, I've just selected 4 works that I find interesting in different ways for us to discuss. And they're all interesting to me because they're different from what's generally thought of as breastfeeding. Generally, I think most art depicting breastfeeding is quite positive and quite idealised, and there's a sense of joy and connection between the mother and the child. And perhaps this is because many of the works depicting breastfeeding focus on Mary and Jesus. But I feel like because those works depict the Immaculate Conception, Nativity story, and other well-known stories about Mary and about Jesus, those dominate the way that people will interpret those works, or they might even feel that they don't need to interpret those works at all because it's just a story that they already know. So I thought we might focus on some works of art that represent different breastfeeding stories, some of them that do represent that relationship between the Madonna and child, but in unusual and unexpected ways, and then some other works of art that are quite different. And the first image I wanted to ask you about was this one called Lucky Jersey Boy by Heath Hearn. This is from 2001. And I wonder whether my approach to this might differ from yours, because I feel like I'm impatient to draw out the controversies and the debates that this might raise, while I'm not sure what a gallery would want to do with that, whether the gallery would want to avoid controversy or to draw as many people in as possible. So it might not want to take a hard line, and some of the ways that you've talked about leaving things open for interpretation might kind of lead you towards particular ways of representing this. I feel like there is an element of sexualization in this image. Whoever this lucky Jersey boy is, I don't know whether he's the baby receiving the milk, or is he the father, or is he another onlooker watching this breastfeeding scene. The title seems to invite an engagement with sexualization of breastfeeding that I know many women still describe as something that they encounter while they're breastfeeding. People still see the act as somehow sexual and the breasts as sexual objects, even in that moment of breastfeeding. And there are quite problematic images, media images, discouraged from breastfeeding or from breastfeeding in public because of society's sexualization of the breasts and their difficulty disentangling themselves from this. And so they feel sexually exposed when they're breastfeeding. And I'm coming to this work without really any knowledge of the artist or any of these works, how they've been described or received beyond the very limited information available online, usually in gallery sites or online repositories that reproduce the works, and in this case on the artist's own website. So I don't know whether this artist has discussed this work or maternity, but I do know that his works are all very similar visually, and they often represent water and ports, landscapes, and sometimes collections of disparate everyday objects. And he does have a collection of female nudes in positions of repose, which would generally be considered to appear sexualized. And there are also repeated circular images. They are often portholes, or they sometimes look like plant cells, even though sometimes they're boats or they're tables, but they're rendered in a circular shape in the centre of the work. So for me, that invites a kind of interpretation of engagement with the womb, but I might be just over emphasising that aspect of the circular image. So I feel like there is an element at which I can kind of justify that the painting evokes a sexualized representation of breasts while breastfeeding. But I also feel like the image is really quite obscure, and it doesn't tell the usual breastfeeding story. It feels almost as though the whiteness of the image is the milk, and the milk might dominate the story, and the act of feeding also seems to dominate the human subjects, who are very undefined here on the image. It's also a massive kind of image against a skyline, bigger than the human being would be if it was a realistic representation. And because it's outdoors, that's also exciting to me, because it's breastfeeding outdoors. It feels like there's so much I could say about this work of art from the perspective of being just an interested observer. And it seems to open up so many different directions to explore breastfeeding and the ways that breastfeeding has been represented. So I'd love to know how you might write about this image, or what you might want audiences to think about, or how you might enable audience engagement if you were going to display this painting, and what you might include on the gallery labels or what you might exclude. What do you think about this image?
I think well, it's very different to anything that we've got in the Barber for a start. But on kind of first looking at it, it seems to be an image that is made with this male gaze, which is something that is so common in art. Obviously, you know, the woman portrayed by the man as the man sees her. I think sometimes providing information around sort of wider lenses, when you're aware of the male gaze as a concept, you can then take that lens and look at many different artworks with that realization. A little bit in the same way as you can have the Venn diagram of colonial worldviews, and then you're equipped to spot them and investigate further yourself. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of backed up by the fact that there's no face on the woman there. It's very much focused on her body and not her as a person, and she almost becomes part of this landscape in a way. She's sort of quietly serving her purpose, whether that be a sexual purpose or the purpose of feeding the child, or the intertwined nature of that, as you kind of touched upon. Something else that strikes me when you're talking about the use of water in his work as well. Quite often in art, water and sexualization of women are put together. There is this idea of fluids and femininity that sometimes comes through in art, that I wonder if that's relevant here as well. Yeah, that's my first view on this one.
Yeah, I was thinking similar, really. I think it can be good to explore ideas of the male gaze and use that as the lens in which to approach this particular work, but also equally to balance that with this specific context as well, because it can be sometimes I feel quite easy to sort of use the male gaze and that sort of theory to explain away an artwork in a sense. So it's very much trying to bring it back to this particular artist, this particular painting as well. So I think context in that case would be quite key. And if the artist perhaps himself is still alive, has spoken about these issues and themes, it could be great to include a quote there as well. So we get a more rounded feel of the artist's own approach. I think people really like hearing directly from artists, and this is an opportunity here to do that as it's a contemporary work. It does seem like such a physical image as well. It's that kind of tension between the abstract nature of it and then with the figures that really dominate the work, even though they're towards the bottom of the composition. Everything seems to be kind of folding around them. They're almost cocooned, it seems, by the landscape, which is both perhaps quite cozy and comforting, but also a bit claustrophobic as well. It's this kind of tension with the sort of womb idea and inside and outside, perhaps. And there does seem to be this kind of rhythm to all the shapes that leads your eye around the whole work, but coming very much back to the figures that you keep wanting to look at again, because partly you can't see the woman's face. You're constantly trying to know perhaps who it is and get past that kind of generalized view, but we're denied that. So there's kind of tension with looking at the work as well. And I also thought water was really important here, because it's the kind of underscore dash at the bottom, kind of a signing off of the work or perhaps what it's about. And then equally, it appears again in the middle and at the top. So it seems like everything's really held together by water and these fluids. And it makes you think perhaps about the menstrual cycle and tides and breaking waters and giving birth. So it's almost like there's lots of different moments here within the work.
There's also the idea of the vessel, isn't there, I suppose, in this work as well. The ship being a vessel, the woman being a vessel, the cocoon. Yeah, I could spend ages picking and talking about this one work. But I think in terms of working with people, some of those light touch things can be really helpful, and again creating a safe space depending on who you're working with, and you don't know what people's experiences are going to be, so making sure that they feel supported if you were to have a discussion with people around it.
Okay, so shall we move on and look at the next image then? And then I do apologise, these are quite haphazard because they're just things that I find exciting. So we're now moving to around about 1450, and its second image here is Madonna and Child by Jean Fouquet, and it's one panel of a diptych. And again, this feels unusual to me because the mother figure looks emotionally detached from the baby, or perhaps even frustrated, unhappy. The baby looks quite unhappy as well, and that each subject in the painting is quite distinct, and there isn't the usual sense of an idealized image of mother and child, or even much of a sense of togetherness. Even the cloth seems to separate them. There's also an audience for this feeding moment, but it's a very strange audience of something that I thought looked quite demonic, but I think perhaps they're angels. And it seems to look futuristic to me in many ways, the way the image is put together. If I was going to guess what kinds of responses this might evoke in somebody engaged with breastfeeding, I might suggest that it would remind them of breastfeeding with an audience or with critics. So sometimes those helpfully intended voices of advice, which are more often than not very helpful, or it might make them think of the dissatisfaction of breastfeeding sometimes, perhaps when the child refuses to feed. But what do you think? What would you draw attention to if you were going to display this work?
Yeah, it's such an interesting image, and comparing it to the last one as well is quite an exciting kind of combination or juxtaposition, really. I think similar to you, I was struck by the kind of tension or awkwardness within the scene, that you have this angelic audience, really, and there's no kind of breathing space there. All the cherubims are really packed in within the composition. And then you have the mother and child, neither of whom kind of look very sort of comfortable or connected with each other. There's no eye contact there. Everyone is looking at something else and not at each other and not at the viewer. So it seems very disconnected within that way, and a kind of lack of engagement between the mother and son as well. She's not encouraging him, and he's actually pointing to something else outside of the picture that isn't at the viewer and the viewer's space. So it constantly seems to ask questions in that sense. And it's already a work that's out of context again, because it was part of a diptych. So we're seeing only a part of the whole story in that sense. So I think because they are in different collections, it would be very interesting to have a reproduction or a loan of the other part of the work to kind of help see how it perhaps used to function or should have functioned originally, and to see the whole story, because I think Christ is pointing towards that other part of the panel. So it's very much meant to work together to help us unpick it and unpick the meaning. I was also really struck of how modern the work seems, even though it's sort of that late medieval time, and particularly her dress as well. She seems very regal. She's got the fur of royalty that she's wearing with her cloak, that kind of ermine fur, and it seems that she's got that really clinched in waist. So it doesn't really seem like a mother perhaps who was just given birth either. It's very idealised. It's very modern for the artist's own time. It's a very kind of fashionable Madonna, which is strange perhaps. And that got me thinking about the time and the artist in which it was made, really, and thinking about the colour scheme as well. It's that red, white and blue. It's like the French flag, and we have the French artist. So there's political dimensions going on within the work as well, perhaps kind of glorifying France, and equally the patron of the work, who I think is shown as one of the male figures in the other half of the panel. So there's quite a lot going on. It's sort of that kind of timeless historical scene mixed with the artist and the patron's present. So there's personal meaning to it, as well as the wider biblical and political context. Becca.
Yeah. I think this work really, she seems so sanitized. We were talking with the last work about liquids and femininity. Something that is associated with femininity sometimes is that the bodily, especially when we're talking about breastfeeding or reproduction, giving birth, menstrual cycles. All of this is removed from this female figure that we see in front of us. She is completely pristine. And I mean, part of that, I'm sure, is probably to do with the fact that this is no ordinary relationship between mother and child. This is a being that is on her knee rather than, any normal child. But it does make me wonder about how women in 1450 may have felt when looking at this. Would they have compared themselves to this idealized version of motherhood? I imagine women in 1450 did not look like this on the whole. They probably looked, different, less pristine, I would have thought, as all of us do in comparison to this woman. I think that's quite interesting. I think it would be perhaps interesting to problematize this this depiction, and maybe an artist's response that pulls out some of this kind of pristine, angelic otherworldly themes that are going on in this. And I think it, you could really look at a really interesting kind of contemporary response, like a video or performance work around this could be really interesting. And you could also bring into that, how people feel about it now, and have that dialogue between past and present through an artist response could be really lovely, and really powerful. It's so striking, isn't it? I'm really glad that you chose it.
Good. The third image is probably the most conventional of the four, and again it's an image of the Madonna and Child, but there is more of a sense of connection between them. This is a Rio image called the Nursing Madonna from around 1675. It feels to me like they've been disturbed in a private moment, and there still isn't a sense of necessarily joy. I think maybe there's a look of exhaustion or surprise or perhaps discomfort at being observed, but it's quite different from the last one. And I wondered what you would want audiences to think about in relation to this work.
Yeah, it's such an engaging work because it seems so informal compared to what we've seen. It is that interrupted moment, and they seem like individual people as well. You can perhaps imagine knowing them. And for me, one of the things that really stood out here was the importance of touch as well. They're touching each other at different points, and it seems quite relaxed and informal, but yet the point of touch is so tender too. And there's that real emphasis on hands and on skin and the kind of safety of that as well. And I love the way that the child's legs are kind of dangling down. It seems such a relaxed pose, and quite kind of like dynamic as well. You can imagine them like squirming around, moving a bit under this gaze that they've suddenly realised perhaps is upon them. And I think that's kind of emphasised by the soft palette as well, and the way that it's so dark around the edges. They're kind of enveloped within that. So that for me seemed a key part of it, as well as the eye contact. It makes you feel a bit uncomfortable, and that perhaps you should be looking away because it's a moment that's just between the two of them that they've been sharing, and it's been interrupted now. So I feel like as a viewer, you're very aware of yourself as well and about where you're looking. So it makes you think through what are we looking at and why, and who should be looking, and what does it mean or why does it matter about that as well. And the woman's breast is uncovered, but it's not really exposed for the viewer at all. It's also hidden, even though we also know it's uncovered. So I thought that was an interesting layer to it, as well as perhaps thinking that it's quite discreet as well, the way that exposed flesh has been portrayed. And is that to do with ideals of modesty and beauty at the time, and a woman's place and who she should be seen by or choose to show to? So it does say a lot, I think, about the context and when it's made, as well as it seeming quite a timeless image because it's this lovely moment between a mother and child. It's kind of doing both at the same time.
Yeah, I think comparing it to the last work, it seems like we know from researching this artist that Rio is interested in sort of portraying the everyday and, the reality of people. But I also wonder if, this kind of wholesome image that we're looking at, this really sort of benign relationship, is necessarily always representative of what mothers might experience, or expect to experience, perhaps, which could be an interesting area for conversation around different people's experiences of what they expect motherhood to be, and what it maybe turns out to be, or how it evolves. It's even though this one is she's disheveled, there is that reality. You're not expected to be pristine, as with the last image, but at the same time, there's still an expectation there that is maybe not always helpful.
No, it's still idealised. It's that kind of ideal relationship that one might want or that you're told about will be happening. Yeah, quietly powerful, I think.
Yeah. The final image seems to look probably quite similar to that in many ways. This is Black Mother by Ernest Nashel, and it was painted around 1927 to 1931. But I suppose what makes it, I mean, again, it looks like they're being disturbed in this private moment, and they're outside, perhaps in a public park, in a secluded part of a public park or something like that. But it feels as though the subject of the Black breastfeeding mother wouldn't have been particularly prominent at that time, especially in work by a Jewish painter from Prague who worked in Berlin. I first came across this image in an article by Sarah Levitt, who was head of Leicester Arts and Museums Service. And she wrote an article about how little was known about the representations of breastfeeding in art. And the article was from 2016. So again, the mother's expression implies that this moment of breastfeeding is being disturbed by an unexpected interruption from an onlooker. And both mother and baby hold the viewer's gaze. So the baby seems to be perhaps, I don't know, asserting its right to be fed. There's actual feeding going on in this image, unlike the previous two. And in many of the images that I have seen, the baby is passive or undistracted, no matter what's going on around the mother. And that perhaps makes breastfeeding appear more straightforward than in this image where the baby's holding the viewer's eye. And I want to think about context with this, really, because it seems to have so much to say about the subject of art and who paints or represents those subjects. And in Sarah Levitt's article, she notes that Ernst Nashel tended to paint subjects who might be considered to be on the margins of society in various ways. She said that he painted provocative paintings of ordinary workers, Black people, gypsies, and the unemployed. His exhibition was actually shut down by the Nazis because it was considered too radical, and he later changed his name and his style of painting in response to this. So that might be another way that audiences might be engaged with this work. But that kind of felt slightly problematic to me because it reminded me of the way that in teaching post-colonial literary studies, the context can often dominate the work itself. So the style or the form can often be ignored in favour of an overemphasis on context and message. And my students often neglect things like the aesthetics of the text and become too focused on a literary work's function, as if it was a historical document. So even though those works might represent a really exciting and unknown or upsetting historical moment or event or a time, or make an important political statement, it still feels like a bit of a risk that that's what comes out rather than something to do with the painting itself, or even to do with this individual woman and the baby that she's feeding. So I wondered what you might think about this. Is this something that you also see as a risk too, the risk of overemphasizing context in favour of the aesthetics of a piece of work? What would you do with this painting if you were going to display it, and what would you ask audiences to engage with?
Yeah, I love the way that they both seem so assertive and that they're kind of carrying on with what they're doing, or almost like, I can't talk now, I don't want to talk now, including the baby. I think it's quite powerful and empowering because of that, and different to the other images that we've seen in that sense. It also seems like a very individual portrait as well, so it would be great to look into who the people were and their particular stories, or what was happening in their lives, specifically just them around this time. So making the context and the content personal as well, because it could be obviously looked at from lots of different levels and emphasising the context and the turbulence and terror of the time, but also perhaps looking at this little pocket of assertiveness and power that we see in here despite that. So it's not wanting to take away the work's power and the subject's power at that point. And also just the colours are so beautiful, the way they look very sculptural within the work. There's a lot that could be said about the technique as well, and how that wraps into perhaps the artist's relationship with the sitters. That could be another dynamic potentially to explore.
Yeah, I think the context is important in this artwork, especially knowing about the artist and their own experience of persecution, of fleeing, of you know, the idea of being persecuted to the point of eradication. And you know, this woman seems, and the baby as well, as you said, you know, the eye contact does seem defiant, and it's almost like breastfeeding in this image with this context could be seen as perhaps, you know, defiant survival, you know. And I feel like she's on the move as well, you know. I feel like she could be waiting for a bus, or she could be she's obviously not at home. She's got a hat on, she's in public, so it's, you know, she's I just feel you get a sense of her, yeah, defiant survival. And, you know, despite this persecution across Europe at the time, in different ways, that the artist is experiencing, and perhaps this woman has experienced as well. You know, we will go on, we will feed our children, and we will, you know, however we need to. But yeah, there is a danger of, you know, we've had this with some of the research that we've done. You want to provide so much context, because every little bit can create new interpretations or reactions or emotions, and really change the meaning of an artwork. If I didn't know that this artist, for example, had this experience of persecution, or was, you know, a radical socialist, I don't think I'd feel the same about this painting. I think I'd be concerned about objectification more so. Not that I'm not at all, but, you know, that context does change it slightly. Yeah, it's a difficult balance, to provide context and provide space. And I suppose it is going through that with a fine-tooth comb. It takes ages. It takes a really long time, some really hard thinking and multiple viewpoints to pick out what is essential information contextually, and what can be left to interpretation, to do this work justice and give it a fair viewing. But it's fantastic work. I did actually manage to see it last week, but kind of accidentally. I was over at Leicester, which I was really, really glad to see it in person. It's displayed quite high up in a sort of a salon hang with other work. So I suppose, you know, something that I think Helen might have touched upon, but, you know, what other works you place this with, of course, changes the meaning as well. And yeah, I'd love to see these works that you've picked out today displayed together in real life one day sometime. That would be great.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. Okay, well, thank you so much. We've talked for ages about loads of exciting things, and I suppose I should round up. I wondered if you have any quick predictions or suggestions about what either might happen next or should happen next in the art world in relation to the broader kind of decolonising agenda, decolonising art, decolonising the gallery. Any kind of last kind of statements about what might or should happen next, or anything that you're seeing as a general trend or direction?
I think diversify the workforce is essential. You know, we're so aware of that ourselves. You know, our own position in our research as, you know, white women, and I feel that the sector can only go so far with the current demographic of people working inside these institutions. That's something that we're really aware of. Other than that, this point about sensitivity versus contestation, I think definitely caring for each other and not necessarily at the expense of being critical of each other, still keeping that criticality, you know, those critical friends, but trying to bring into that an element of care as well, and sensitivity and understanding. In the face of this kind of work often being presented in the media as something that is an attack or you know, violent or judgmental.
Yeah, I would say perhaps just keeping open and keep having conversations with different people, because that way everyone always learns and sort of helps to critique each other or lift each other up and move forward. So it's about being open to that and open to being flexible and to continually trying to improve and do better and learn from things.
Yeah, I feel like collaborative work and co-creation is really essential in any kind of decolonising agenda, and it feels like that's what you've talked about doing repeatedly throughout the work that you've been doing, having open conversations. And it feels like the kinds of audience engagement activities and events that you've been undertaking must make a really important contribution to the effort to change things and to make the art world more open to audiences and more open to diverse audiences. And it's been really interesting to hear about you talking about how you're responsive to audiences, and that feels like a really important kind of stage or step forward. And in response to that, part of what this event wants to do is to hear the responses from our audience today to this event, but also to these 4 artworks, so that we can continue that conversation beyond the event. So one of the ways we'd like to continue this conversation with our participants today is through a creative activity. But of course, if you have any responses at all to this, you're very welcome to contact Formations by email or to comment on the YouTube event. So just very briefly then, I wanted to introduce the creative response that we're inviting to today's conversation with Nottingham Trent University's writer-in-residence, Eve Mackis. So please, I would love you to kind of be inspired by the Hidden Histories project that took place at the Barber and write your own responses, your own kind of gallery text to any of the works of art that we've talked about today. So please feel free to select one of the works of art that we've discussed, write gallery text that's meaningful to you, that prioritises what you think is important about the work, and send it to us. Either to formations.ac.uk, or if you want to just send something very brief on the YouTube chat. But if you write a longer text and send it to the email address, myself and Eve Mackis will collate those responses and we'll publish them on the Bonington Gallery's Formations website. And the aim of this is to demonstrate, firstly, that there are multiple responses to works of art, as we've been talking about, but we also want to know how audiences respond to art depicting breastfeeding. So I hope this will help to keep this conversation alive and keep it going. And I wanted to thank everybody for joining us tonight, but to thank you very, very much, Becca Randle and Helen Cobby, for your insight into working with audiences at galleries. your insight into how galleries work behind the scenes to engage audiences and to bring works of art to life, and for sharing your work on decolonising art and galleries at the Barber Institute today. So thank you so much for being here. It's been such a fascinating conversation, and thanks so much for talking about the pieces of art that I've kind of gathered and want to think about as well. It's been fascinating to hear your responses to this. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jenny, for having us.